We did it. We started half an hour. We had started 20 minutes, half an hour late. The first 10 minutes were my fault, but we did it. Did it. Okay, so we're back. We're back. So Chris, how, I mean, it's, as far as the last couple of weeks have gone for us personally, obviously, you're talking about a notion of surrender, and you have quite a lot to say about that on your site, but as far as that's concerned, I mean, is for somebody who does not actually make it a habit, I guess you could say, which would be nice, I guess you could say, understand or even practice that surrender when necessary. How would you necessarily, I guess you could say, get somebody to understand exactly what surrender is? Because I think that what we see sometimes is an association of surrender with, I guess you could say, negligence, to some degree. And I think that is sometimes why a lot of folks have a difficult time surrendering, because I'm letting this get away from me. This is something that I need to, this requires care and hands-on care at that. But how would you, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, I'd say that surrender is often something that is given negative connotations because it's as if you are sort of being a doormat. Mm-hmm. You're letting things happen to you, you're letting circumstances happen, and there's nothing coming back from you. But it's different than that. It's not. When we take the personal identity out of the equation, the conditioned identity, what most people identify with,
sure,
then there isn't a solid me identity there where one needs to fight against things, So the surrender is really, it's about letting go of the conditioned identity. And that's all you're letting go of. You're not letting go of, again, it's like we said, you actually gain more control by giving up the control.
Yes.
And so, as we stay in awareness, we're flowing with the universe, and the more that we surrender, the more that we flow with the universe, the more that we go into the tide, if you will, and the tide takes us along. And obviously that can be scary for the conditioned identity because it doesn't want to, it's so used to trying to control things all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how we've been taught. That's been our conditioning.
It's expected to believe that to have complete and utter command over your everything, other human beings included, is absolutely necessary in order to maintain equilibrium.
Absolutely.
Well, I was, I like that. I like that thought. I mean, I try to tell people that it's about, permeability. I mean, I think you said that in our last video where it's like, if there's no brick wall for this thing to hit, then there's no impact whatsoever. And I think a bit of the struggles that I've noticed, with folks nowadays, especially, despite all this wonderful energy that I've been hyping up, like, what are you talking about? No, I think that a lot of this, the shifts that are going on, with this planet, I mean, there has to be sort of there is some kind of, I guess you could say, restructuring happening as you are aware. And, sometimes to get to that restructuring, you have to, I think of it as almost tearing apart a house. You have to take down the walls, pull out the insulation, God forbid there are any rats in there, but if that's in there, that has to go as well. And, that can be an unpleasant experience unless you let that happen.
Because that's it, yeah.
It's...
Yeah, if you're trying to fight it, it's gonna be very, very uncomfortable. And, like you said, it's really what's happening is all that's being asked is to let go of what is actually not you anyway.
Right.
It's the conditioning, what most people identify with, is really something that's been accumulated over the period. It's something that you've gathered while you've been here. You've gathered a name, you've gathered this body, you've gathered learnt behaviour, you've gathered beliefs. But these things, if something can be gathered, then that means it can also be taken away, and therefore it can't essentially be you.
Right.
Because what we all are is something that is unchanging, and is everlasting, therefore it cannot be changeable, you know. So that's all the surrender is. All that process is just letting go of what is actually not you in the first place.
Right.
And the universe is always presenting us with those opportunities to be able to deepen more and let go and let go. That's really essentially what, from my experience, the spiritual journey really is, if you will. It's just really letting go of what is not you to come fully into what is you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And what is you, you know, I think we tried discussing it in our last video, you know, it really is, you know, the observer, or, you know, or the player as I term it. And, you know, that is essentially the you. That is one thing that goes unchanged. Now I think that what happens is that we have a bit of there's an incongruency, or a perceived incongruency. It's not really an incongruency. It's a perception. You know, between creation and surrender, you know, and I think that the creation versus surrender, the duality.
Yeah, you were just chatting about that, yeah, about the creation and surrender, yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, we do have this tendency to, you know, like I said, we romanticize this, we excuse and validate ourselves with this duality, and I believe that, you know, the one can actually manufacture a duality out of anything. So this surrender versus creation, I mean, how would one counsel another to reconcile that? I mean, you know, for me, I personally would just say, well, you're just deciding what you want to experience. You know, are you creating an experience where you are, you know, you are starting, you know, a new line of work or a career because you like that activity, or are you, you know, do you want to engage in a romantic relationship, something like that, you know, and that's a creation, you know, that is an experience that you choose for yourself. You know, you make your petition however you choose, and then you surrender and let it, you know, and then you let it come to you. I mean, would that be, you know, how you would kind of reconcile the two, or, I mean, because I don't think they need reconciliation, but I mean, I think that there are some that do.
I mean, I think that often what gets talked about is what people call the law of attraction, and or the law of magnetics.
Right.
And from my experience, I'm not sure whether that is complete truth. I think that there is an element of that, but I think that also we come here with a destiny, certain destiny, where certain things will be experienced, but in the process of that, there is this kind of leeway for some free will to take place. So yeah, it's a very interesting, I can't say that for sure, but it's been my experience that often things happen that is completely out of one's control, and almost as if it is part of a destiny to be fulfilled.
Right. Well, and I mean, I honestly agree with that. I think that there are certain events that we, I'm not certain if I would say manufacture in this lifetime. I'm certain that the energy of the means, I mean, I relate a lot of things back to alchemy, to some extent. Not quite the, the hermetic alchemy, I guess you could say, but, I think you might, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. You didn't speak of it, so. I relate everything back to alchemy in that sense, where I think that actually a lot of, attraction, creation, magnetics, I believe that, personally for myself, I believe a lot of that is like the beginning. That is like your first start. We have to know that our thoughts create our reality. And then I also believe that intention, will, and experience transmute that thought, that energy into reality. And that there are certain blocks, perhaps we are occupied too much by a certain energy or a certain frequency, which would malign the new experience. Surrendering that energy, that not necessarily negative, but that energy that you are currently occupied with, to be transmuted into a new experience, that would be, I see it as a trade. I mean, to me, it's an equivalent exchange. I mean, in a very loosely, almost law of physics sort of sense, there is a conservation of that available energy, I think, while we are in these bodies.
Yeah, I think the more conscious that we become, I mean, the Gnostics used to talk about what they used to call the daemon.
Right.
And they used to say that the journey, if you will, is for the daemon and the lowest part of themselves, the ego, if you will, to become one.
Mm-hmm.
So we could say the ego becoming one with the higher self. And I think that our thoughts do create the reality in terms of the flavouring, our perceptions, the flavouring of what we see.
Sure.
But whether or not it completely attracts, we can't have full free will, because otherwise that would contradict everybody else's free will and also the direction that the universe itself is evolving in.
Right.
Which obviously is so vast, so we can't have total free will, but the more conscious we become, the more free will we do have.
That makes sense.
And, yeah.
And do you think that maybe, and this might explain to some degree, the notion of not necessarily surrender, but turning over that spiritual authority to another, and we'll leave it at that because this could turn into a whole different video, and there are enough of those. Turning over that authority to another gives them, for more space, more free will, I guess you could say, than the rest. In that sense, in a lot of spiritual groups, there's the belief that the more space, more energetic space one takes up, the more, I guess you could say, influence they have, regardless of whomever's around. I mean, it follows, what you're saying. You take up more space, you have more authority, you are more in connection, in a sense, in more control. Now, when it comes to, I think, the notion of surrender, I think that what happens is we confuse surrender with surrendering. Does that make sense? Just to kind of bring it a little bit full circle, because I do believe that the law of attraction, again, is a very good first step. But when it comes to creating, it's, there's maintenance to be done. If that makes sense at all. Sorry, I have this tendency to just sort of.
Yeah. So, if you could just clarify what you meant by the surrender and the surrendering.
Well, the notion of surrender versus surrendering. To surrender something to me, I guess you could say, would be, a surrender is an allowance, to allow a transformation, a transition to happen. But to be constantly in the process of surrendering instead of completing the surrender and beginning something else, to be in the constant process of surrendering is almost to affirm the fact that you are, again, giving away that authority, if that makes sense. Because when you say surrender, allowance, go with the flow, to me that is very different than surrendering, which is sort of, almost advocating, your spiritual authority over your own life. You're constantly in that process of, okay, now I won't make that call, I won't create this experience, I'm going to, see what happens. And, if the planets, the Pope, my father, and all this other stuff, have something better to say, then they will, and that's sort of that's an interesting, that's where I kind of draw the line. I think that's where a lot of people get stuck between surrender and surrendering. I think surrender is sort of a, it's not, I don't know if surrender is a constant process, or maybe, I could be completely wrong. I believe it's sort of a one-off decision. And to surrender is just to sort of embark on yet another experience. While surrendering, it's more of, you're stopping in the middle of the road, and you're spinning a bottle, or to decide which road to take next. You don't know. That bottle could spin forever until something tells you where to go. And that's sort of surrendering. Does that make sense? Or did I just?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay, kind of did. Okay, getting back.
Yeah. As well, I think that there's two types of surrender as well, where sometimes people get to a certain point where it's, I give up and I'm done with things, and kind of they're not taking care of themselves, they're not taking responsibility for anything.
Right.
But then there is, as you've just said, there is a spiritual surrender where you're surrendering to the unknown, you're surrendering to the universe, and you're letting that take you along.
Right. It's trust and allowance.
Yeah.
And that's essentially, I think, that it is a fundamental act. Hopefully not for long. I should qualify that. I'm assuming not for long, or it was a greater lack in the past, because if we do not have everything under our thumb, if we are not in complete control, complete command, who's to say some treacherous person isn't going to come sweep it out from underneath us. But I agree with you there. I think that there is a bit of a neglect that happens when, I wouldn't, there is almost an opportunity in that sort of feeling of defeat, though, to start something completely different, and it's a matter of figuring out what does it take to understand the faith in that final step,
Yeah. It's like you said before, it's like you said about the house breaking down, these walls are dissolving, the walls of condition, people suddenly realize something may happen, and they realize what I thought about myself and about the world simply isn't true.
Right.
Because it's been tested, and whatever's happened, and it's made me realize, wow, things are not like I thought they were. And that can be an initial realization, which then leads them to drop this condition, and that becomes then part of the surrender. That's the first process of surrender. I experienced this myself when I was in the hospital with the salmonella, and that was one of my moments of that surrender, where I suddenly realized that I didn't know what was going to happen, and the thoughts that were going through the mind, I realized that they were just complete garbage. and so from that realization, then a surrender comes, where I don't know then, what now? Sometimes you might find yourself looking up to the sky and saying, what now?
Yeah.
What do I do?
No, absolutely.
And so that's surrender.
It is. And it's so funny how you handled it that way, with your cheating death experience. Mine was, nice try, next time give it your A game. But, temperament change there.
Why do I always look up?
Well, normally I just stare off into space in one direction, and nobody does. But no, I think that's actually, you don't need the luxury of having to cheat death to approach that circumstance. You're absolutely right. I think that a lot of the difficulty with surrender comes with, I think that there is a sort of attachment to recreating a past experience, which we know is impossible. We can't get back there. Yet. Who knows? But we have not figured out the technology as far as that is concerned. So if you want to go figure that out, that's great. But, I feel that sometimes, it's not even conditioning at that point in time. It's a desire or a sort of attachment to a moment or a feeling. It gives up the surrender, because I think that there's always this belief that we're trying to get back to a place, back to a place where you are more financially stable, or your marriage is working, the way you wanted it to. And I work with a lot of people in that area, where it's more like, well, how do I get my career to go back? And I'm like, well, let's not get your career to go back. Let's take this as an opportunity to move your career into a different place. I can, we'll find a way to give you that feeling again, but it won't be the same.
Yeah, the mind wants to go back to something that is comfortable, that is familiar.
Mm-hmm.
It wants to go back to what it knows. That's why so often people are stuck in routines, because the mind loves a routine. It loves to know where it's going to be, what it's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it comes back to that element of control. They're wanting some kind of control, security. But I must say that, for me, my experience is that the spiritual process of awakening, if you will, is something that is totally separate from these notions that have often been given to spiritual awakening, which is that when you awaken, suddenly everything great starts to happen, your life flourishes, really exciting and positive things come into your life. Yes, that can happen, but that is something that is separate from the initial or the essential awakening process. The awakening process is simply the realization of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
It's as simple as that. It's not about getting anywhere or being in any different circumstances.
It has nothing to do with results.
Absolutely, yeah.
I agree with you 110%.
Yeah,
yeah,
it's simply becoming aware of what you are, who you are, and again, seeing from that perspective of the witness, seeing that everything is perceived, everything is actually in front of you. So, yeah, they are two separate things, and they seem to get entangled. And it's just something more for the mind to try and cling on to. If I awaken, then suddenly I'll have all these great things happen and my life will flourish. Mm-hmm. And of course, that can happen. It's, like we've just said, it's not the essential thing.
And do you think that perhaps there may also be maybe conditioning? Hopefully it is just mere conditioning and not a choice. The guilt that comes from assuming that command. You do assume command over your own life at that point in time, and you have to watch your likes and your dislikes. As we were talking about before I started recording, where I was talking about how the last 2 weeks have been, and could have been, it probably could have gone a lot smoother if I knew unconsciously that I still sort of relish the battle. It's something you have to keep an eye on, and there may be some guilt in realizing what your tastes are. Maybe whoever's playing me right now really does like to be the tank, and maybe it could be more than that. But I think there is also a guilt that comes with, assuming that command in your own life. Why doesn't anyone believe they deserve good things? Or perhaps they'd have no problem assuming command, but they choose to, harm themselves in some capacity. It's a strange. It's not dualism, but I think it goes along with what you're saying. I mean, your life is not bliss just because you've gotten an awareness.